So we're about ready to begin. And my name is Carrie Lattimore, and I am an associate professor of history at Trinity University and also the department chair. And it is my honor to be with you at the Witte and to moderate this session on cotton, slavery, and Texas culture. And I think we're going to really have an amazing session. One of the things that is interesting about slavery is how transformative it is. Where I grew up in Virginia. And Virginia and Texas, as we're going to talk about probably today, are very similar states and yet different. We both feel that we are the state, the country. We feel like we are it. But yet the way that we discuss slavery, I think, is a lot different. I grew up in the northern neck of Virginia, and it's an area where the farm that I grew up on was probably the place that my ancestors were enslaved. And it defined economic relationships, business relationships, social relationships. Indeed, slavery was a completely transformative institution. Cotton transformed us, not cotton, but tobacco transformed us. Farming transformed us. In Texas, it's different. When I moved here, people did not talk a lot about slavery in Texas. The fact that Texas was a part of the Confederacy was not something that is overtly discussed, except by some people who are in the know-how, but we don't talk about it in the same kinds of ways. And so I think that this session will bring that into greater context and to bring some nuance onto the ways that we look at slavery and cotton, and we think about how Texas really becomes part of the Confederacy. We are privileged and honored to have Dr. Andrew Torget, who's an historian of 19th century in North America at the University of North Texas, where he holds the University Distinguished Teaching Professorship and directs the Digital Humanities Lab. A veteran of pioneering work in digital scholarship, he is an award-winning lecturer, and I hear that he is a very long lecturer from what my information on him I heard, and I need to move fast because apparently he had a 26-hour lecture. 26 and a half, and is part of the Genesis Book of World Records, correct? But it was for a very good cause, the portal to Texas history. So he knows what he's doing. And at each point during that period, 10 students were there consistently, correct?
We had 35 make it the entire
Wow. His most recent book, Seeds of Empire, Cotton, Slavery, and the Transformation of the Texas Borderlands, won 12 book awards and honors, and was hailed by Texas Monthly as, quote, the most nuanced and authoritative rewriting of Texas origin myth to date. So we are well blessed at this time to have Professor Torget. Before he comes, let me say this. Tobacco may have transformed Virginia and some other states. Cotton transformed America. And as we think about all of the things that we've talked about today and the transformations and the migrations, cotton creates a lot of this pattern. And so I want us to think more broadly, in a more nuanced manner, of the importance of cotton to the transformation of Texas. And so it is my honor, my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Andrew Torget.
All right. Hey, can y'all hear me okay? All right, beautiful. First, thank you. That's a very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. The Virginia-Texas thing, I think, is a really good jumping off point for what we're talking about, because I went to school in Virginia after having grown up in Texas, and it was the experience of being in Virginia and thinking about tobacco and thinking about those transformations that really brought me back to thinking about where we are today here in San Antonio, in Texas, and the big transformations that have taken the region we're living in through an enormous amount of changes that informs the art. All right, that is in the exhibit that we're all here to talk about, right? The subtitle, obviously, of the exhibition is, Art for History's Sake. And what we want to do in this session really is talk about that history and talk about some of the context within which that art was created and what you're going to see in those exhibits and what you're not going to see. For example, a lot of enslaved people. when we talk about 19th century art. The exhibit has a very large arc of 250 years worth of amazing displays and all kinds of incredible works. But when you get down to it, what I want to talk about is this 50-year period that helps define how we think about Texas in so many different ways. If you've grown up in the state and you took 4th and 7th grade Texas history, it's the first half of the 19th century that we talk about the most, that we think about the most in moments of identity, as you were talking about at the very beginning, how Virginia thinks of its identity and how Texas thinks of its identity is all part of its history. And at the end of the day, Texas derives so much of what it thinks about itself from this incredible 50-year period from 1800 to 1850, where Texas goes from, and you can see this beautiful map of New Spain right here. I don't know if I have a pointer on this, but you can see Texas right over there in the corner. It goes from being an area claimed by the Spanish, but really controlled by the Comanches, right, to a thriving Anglo-Mexican state during the 1820s and the first half of the 1830s, to this crazy thing, the Republic of Texas, that was its own country for 9 whole years, as we like to remind the rest of the United States on a regular basis, right? To becoming the westernmost outpost of the United States when we're annexed, right, in 1845, and then that begins the US-Mexico War. All of that happens in 50 years. It's an incredibly short amount of time, right? And the consequences of that are enormous, because that leads directly to the war between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848 that takes half of Mexico and gives us the modern American U.S. Southwest, right? And defines the modern border of North America between the United States and Mexico in ways that, I don't have to remind you, we are still fighting about. We are still debating. This is the seeds of modern debates and arguments, right? All encapsulated in this one tiny little period. And I remember, having grown up in the state, I never could understand, having taken 4th and 7th grade Texas history, how does that happen, right? How does that happen in such a short period of time? So that's what I want to talk to you guys about, right? That's the argument that I want to make to you guys, is how that happens and how that has so much to do with cotton, all right, as the cash crop of the 19th century, what tobacco did transforming the North American shores in the 16 and 1700s, cotton was that in the 1800s and really up through the mid-20th century for the United States, right? Cotton is woven throughout all of these periods and in every way this transformation that's happening in Texas, all right? And because of cotton being at the center of all of this, so is enslaved labor during this period in Texas history, right? Which, as we heard at the very beginning in the introduction, isn't usually a part of how we think about Texas history, right? That slavery is at the epicenter of so many of these transformations. But it was, because it was so deeply tied to the economy and to the cotton that was being grown in the region during this time period, all right? So that's the story that I want to tell you guys. And I'm doing it because I want to give us context for the art that you're going to be seeing in the exhibit, right? I want to put this history context around so much of these representations about what this state looks like and how people think about its history, all right? You all ready? All right, here we go. So if you want to understand cotton in Texas, if you want to understand the role of slavery in this early period in the transformations of Texas, can't start in Texas. You have to go to England. Or you have to go to the British Empire. Because as I explained to my students, if you lived in the 19th century, you lived in a British world, all right? Everything the United States has been since World War II, the most powerful economic, military, and political force there is in the world, the British were all of those things in the 19th century. And my students find that weird, because one will invariably say, isn't England an island, and a small one at that? I say, yes, that's true. But they had an enormous influence because they had an enormous economic empire, all right? Much like American power since World War II has been based in large measure on the economic might of the United States. The British had a massive trade empire in the Atlantic world during the 19th century, and they made an enormous amount of money doing that, which helped transformed into military power and everything that went with that, all right? And so much of that trade empire was based on exporting textiles. All right, this is the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution that you guys remember from high school, right, and basic history in college. But the Industrial Revolution and this mechanization of production that happens in places like Manchester and Preston in England, all right, that really transforms the world. It's built around the textile industry in many ways, all right? And so in England, as the textile industry is expanding, all right, they're putting out textiles, cloth, clothing of all sorts, that they're exporting all over the world and making a lot of money doing it. And it's built very heavily on wool, all right, almost exclusively, actually. And so they would shear Scottish sheep, and they would run them through these machines, and then the cloth that they produced as a result of all that, they could export all over the world and make enormous amounts of money doing that. And that was fabulous, and they were doing very well. But the problem is there's only so many Scottish sheep, right? There's only so much that you can scale all of this. And so they start experimenting in the late 1700s with this new fiber, which wasn't really new, it had been around a very long time, but they start experimenting with cotton as an alternative. And cotton turned out to be a fantastic idea for putting through these machines and making cloth with, because cotton, I wager most of you are wearing cotton right now, right? Cotton is very light, it's durable, it's very comfortable, all right? And if you can grow it, you can continue to expand your cotton production. You can get as much of that raw cotton as you could possibly need. You can scale it fairly effectively here. You can also print things on cotton. You can print designs. You can make these things fashionable in terms of what you're producing as textiles. And so you can expand your market that way and sell a whole lot more of this stuff. So in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, all right, British mercantilists started experimenting with cotton. They realized the market was insatiable for the cloth, and so they start converting these machines away from wool and toward cotton. When they do that, especially in the early 1800s, when they start making the full transition, what do they need? Massive amounts of raw cotton, right? And so the British put out a call in 1815, at the end of the War of 1812, in 1815, they put out a call and they say basically, we'll pay top dollar, or top pound, I guess, right, for whoever can produce cotton for us and ship it over here to Liverpool, which we can send up to Manchester and Preston, all right? And so the price of cotton for raw cotton doubles overnight from 15 cents a pound to 30 cents a pound in 1815, in 1 year. It doubles overnight. And you know what the result is? One of the biggest and most consequential migrations in all of American history, all right? As Americans start pouring into the Mississippi River Valley here. You guys see all these lines right here? These are migration routes of people coming down to what will become Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, will be the heart of the Deep South and the Cotton South. They're coming up and down the rivers, which are the highways of the 19th century, to grow cotton for the British Empire and make enormous amounts of money doing it, all right? Why this region? Because it's a great place to grow cotton during this time period. It's really hot in Mississippi, which is fabulous. You have a lot of frost-free days. It's easy to grow cotton. It's not going to get killed by the frost. You've got great soils all over the area. You have wonderful river systems for moving cotton up and down the river. And the best thing of all is you have New Orleans right down there, all right? Established the same year as San Antonio, 1718. And it is an international port, so that if you grow cotton in this region, you can ship it down to New Orleans, and then you can send it from there to all over the world. You can send it to New York. Better than that, you can send it to Liverpool. You can send it to France, which is the second largest buyer in the world at this time. You can send it every which direction you want to go. And so people pour into this region by the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands to do this, to build a factory in a field, all right, to grow cotton on a large scale if they can possibly hope to do it, because this will make you wealthy if you own this place. All right, you can grow the cotton, you can clean it. If you bale it over here, and each of these blocks you guys see in the corner here are cotton bales, are about 450-pound blocks of pure money. All right, you see the steamship there on the river? You load that up with cotton, you send it down to New Orleans. If you can load a ship bound for Liverpool, England with cotton, you can literally make a boatload of money, all right, shipping off to the English. And so the United States goes from producing basically nothing on the world scale in terms of cotton around 1815 to by 1820 we surpass India as the leading grower of cotton in the world, and we are by 1820 supplying 85% of all of the cotton that the British Empire is importing for their textile mills. Think about that. That happens in 5 years. That big of a transformation. This is a revolution. That's why I always call it the Cotton Revolution. And it is massively transformative for North America writ large. All right? Now, not everybody who's coming down to this region is coming voluntarily. When you think of a Mississippi cotton plantation, what do you think of? Slavery, right? And so 40% of the people who are coming down to this region are not coming voluntarily, right? 40% of the people who are coming are men, women, and children who are claimed to be property of somebody else, who are being brought here to labor to be the engine of this cotton empire, right? Why the planters who are coming here bringing so many enslaved people? Because it was really profitable to do that. Every enslaved person that you could put into the fields meant 8 to 10 more acres in cultivation. That's about 8 to 10 more bales every single year. That investment would pay and pay over and over and over again, and it was an incredibly profitable thing. So most white Southerners will never own slaves. They'll never be able to afford to. But all of them want to. And those who can will, because that investment pays and pays and pays again. And so every third person in Alabama was an enslaved person. Half of all Louisianans, half of them were enslaved people by 1820, all right? It's a massive investment. It's a massive movement of people. And the result is, and you can see those numbers right there. Why are we talking about this with Texas? Because this all happens on the Texas border, right? From 1815 to 1820. And by 1820, when Mexico is on the verge of becoming independent, look at those numbers up there. You have 150,000 people in Louisiana, 75,000 in Mississippi, 144,000 in Alabama. That's about 370,000 people, more than a third of a million. Most of them arrived in 5 years, all right, on the border with Texas. How many people in Texas are non-Indian who'd be loyal to Mexico City? About 3,000. 3,000, a third of a million. Who's nervous? Mexico City, right? Who's been watching all of this and is concerned that the Americans could just come over the border at any moment. They could just come pouring over. There's really nothing to stop them. There's no real secure place in Texas in terms of the Spanish Empire of holding onto this region. It's really more controlled by the Comanches anyway. And so Mexico City's watching this and is worried about the population issue. But what they really should be worried about is something they haven't even considered yet, which is going to be even more important, which is the problem of horses. All right? Now, slave labor could make a plantation very profitable, but everything in the 19th century ran on horsepower, right? You need horses for plowing the fields. You need them from hauling carts back and forth from the river, for taking cotton bales down to be shipped. You need them to turn the cotton gin, which will run on horsepower, right, on these plantations. You need them from every aspect of life if you're going to farm successfully. And so when you have a third of a million people moving to this region and creating these massive plantation districts, what do they need to keep that going? Horses. On a large scale, more than they've brought down from places like Virginia, more than they can bring from the Carolinas, more than they can bring from Kentucky or Tennessee. They have a massive shortage of horses, and they desperately need as many of them as they possibly can get. And so there's traders around Mississippi, places like Natchez, who realize this and go looking for horses, because there's going to be a big profit margin to be made if you can bring some horses in. So where do they go? They don't go back to Kentucky. They don't go back to Virginia. They go west, all right? And they happen to run into the biggest horse traders in North America at this time, the Comanches, right, on the plains of Texas. And one of the things you guys will see, obviously, in the art exhibit and all the different pieces is the frequency of horses and livestock in general, the animals of the plains and the animals of Texas, right? One of the things I want to tell you guys about is the power of horses at this time for the transformation of Texas and how central that really is. Because when these traders came from the Mississippi River Valley, okay, you can see the gray right here. This is the Comanche territory that they control pretty heavily, the main plains of Texas, which comes right up to where we are, essentially, the edge of San Antonio. Look over to the east, right, where Louisiana is, where the Mississippi River is. You usually don't think of Mississippi and the plains being very close to each other, but they're not geographically that far away. They're just very different zones, right? So you have traders who come from Mississippi and they come into Texas, they're looking for horses, and they run into either Comanches or more likely different Indian tribes in particular between them who can trade with the Comanches and then come back and trade with the Americans. But you have these Americans who come in looking for horses saying, we need horses. And the Comanches say, well, we've got horses. What can you give us? The Americans say, we have firearms. And the Comanches say, we will take that trade. Yes, that sounds fantastic. So what you have is this weaponization, really, of different, and this has been going on actually by this point for a long time, but you have the Comanches in particular, but different tribes selling horses to these traders and getting weapons that they can't make themselves coming back. And so this horses for arms trade starts going on in the 18 teens and up through the 1820s, and it becomes a massively profitable thing for the Comanches and other Indian groups. They start bringing as many horses as they possibly can and trading them to the Americans, and the Americans will buy as many as they can because it's an insatiable market in Mississippi and Alabama. I'll bet you never think of Mississippi plantations and Comanches, but it is the Comanches who are supplying the horses that makes Mississippi and Alabama possible during this time period, connecting Texas to the Deep South in a real and powerful way, all right? And the Comanches quickly realized that the Americans will pay top dollar for any horse, but they'll particularly pay a lot of money for horses who are already broken, who are already used to being ridden, who could easily be hooked up to a harness. And the best place to find those are here in San Antonio, or in La Bahia, later to be Goliad, where the Tejanos live. And you have these royal corrals that have Spanish horses that have already been broken. So the Comanches declare war on the Tejanos, who live here in San Antonio, who live in La Bahia, and steal their horses and come running through town and decimate them during this time period to supply the cotton farms in Mississippi and Alabama. And they come through and they absolutely destroy the territory. They destroy San Antonio, they destroy La Bahia. They start raiding into Coahuila, Nuevo León, Nueva Santander, later to be Tamaulipas, and just devastate the area during this time period to feed the cotton plantations in Mississippi and Alabama. So cotton brought wealth and prosperity to white people in Alabama and Mississippi, and it brought absolute destruction here to Texas to the Tejanos who lived in the region. And that got so bad that by 1820, the Tejanos here in San Antonio are basically ready to give up. They're ready to abandon the region. How do we know this? Because they said it. All right, the governor of Texas at the time, a guy named Antonio Martinez, he was writing letters to the viceroy in Mexico City basically saying, we're done. We can't survive. We have no backup, no support. We can't handle this kind of onslaught that's been going on, so we're on the edge of collapse, right? You have to know that. I always tell my students when I teach the Texas Survey, you have to understand that position in 1820 if you're going to understand how the Tejanos here in San Antonio react when Moses Austin shows up at that exact moment in December of 1820, right? And when you took Texas history, or at least when I took Texas history in 4th and 7th grade, this is where we often start the story, with the arrival of the Austins, right? Moses, and then when he dies, his son Stephen taking over. But what you have to understand is the position of the Tejanos when the Austins arrive and how they're seeing the position of what's going on in Texas when Stephen F. Austin shows up and basically offers to bring the cotton frontier into Texas. Because what are the Austins offering? They're offering to bring Mississippi to Mexico. They're offering to bring these plantation-style conditions into Texas because it's going to be profitable for, at that time, the Spanish Empire is what they're offering. And this is going to be good for the Americans who come in because in Mississippi it had gotten really hard to buy land. All the competition for good farming land had driven prices up to $50 an acre. And then in the aftermath of the Panic of 1819, nobody had any cash or could afford anything. And so you have all these farmers who would like land, who still want to supply cotton to the British Empire, but aren't able to do so because they can't get their own lands. If you can bring them into Texas, that will hopefully change that for the Anglos, right? It's going to bring the cotton culture into the region, but that's what Austin's offering. That's what he's proposing. He's saying, this has been profitable here, let's bring it in to Texas, all right? Imagine you're the Tejanos here in San Antonio, and you hear that. What's your reaction? Woohoo! Did you say non-Comanches would like to live in Texas? Yes! We will take as many of those as we possibly can. The Tejanos, you gotta remember, they're literally about to abandon the territory. So the Tejano leadership here in San Antonio sees this as the best of bad options. I always say that to my students. This is not the option they would have written on paper, but it's the least bad option available to them. And if you can bring in some settlers who will be committed to the territory, you might have a buffer with the Comanches. More than that, though, it will bring in a connection with New Orleans that is very appealing to the Tejanos, because the Tejanos in San Antonio, those who were of the elite status and made a decent living, the way they did it is they went, for the most part, they went to New Orleans and bought trade goods and then brought them back to San Antonio and sold them in northern New Spain, and they made money doing that. When they went to New Orleans, what did they see? the most profitable cotton trading port in the United States, and all the wealth and prosperity that that had brought to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. What do they want? They want that for Texas. They want that for themselves, right? They want that kind of prosperity that they can be a part of. Is that means bringing slavery into the picture? Okay, that's a means to an end. It's a means to developing the region, all right? And so what I always tell my students and what I always want to explain about this time period is that this is not, when you think about the Anglo-Americans coming in from the United States into Texas during this period, it is not the Austins doing this by themselves, all right? They need the Tejanos. They need the support of the Tejanos. And they couldn't have done any of this without the Tejanos. The Tejanos are the power brokers of this time period. They are the ones making the decisions on whether this is going to go. And these two groups need each other because the Tejanos want that settlement and the development that it will produce. So this is an alliance that makes all of this possible, all right? And they're going to need each other because it's at this exact moment that Mexico becomes independent of Spain in 1821, right? Stephen F. Austin rides into Texas in July of 1821. He gets to San Antonio, where we are right now, in early August. And when he gets there is when word has arrived that Mexico has become independent. That's met with joy among the Tejanos here in San Antonio, but it's also an open question of what is that going to mean? Is this colonization plan going to go forward? And so all those questions have to be answered by a new government that's going to be formed in Mexico City. And so within Mexico, there's a brief emperorship, but basically they decide to build a constitutional federal republic. And so they call a constitutional convention in Mexico City that begins in 1823. Representatives from all over Mexico come to Mexico City to be a part of deciding what this new nation will be. The Tejanos in San Antonio send a man named Erasmo Seguin to go down. And Stephen F. Austin himself, who's just begun his work, is so worried about all of this that he himself goes down to Mexico City. It's a 2,000-mile ride, right? He goes down there because he's afraid that this new Mexican government will say, no Anglo-Americans coming into Texas, and shut it off before it even begins, right? So Austin goes down to Mexico City. The Tejanos have representatives down there, Erasmo being the lead. And they go and they have these debates about whether or not Anglos should be allowed to colonize in Texas. And what Austin is surprised to learn is that most Mexicans across most of Mexico doesn't have a big problem with the idea of Anglo-Americans moving into Texas. It's not the first option they might have picked, but it's the least bad option they have available to deal with the fact that Mexico doesn't really control the region very well. The Comanches have a much firmer grasp. And so most of them say, yes, we can allow Anglo-American immigration into Texas. That'll be fine. And Austin goes, whew, all right, good. They say, but wait a second, there is an issue though. We do have a problem with this thing that you want to bring in with these cotton farmers, which is slavery, right? Because Austin hadn't hidden the fact that he wanted slavery to remain legal in Mexico because that was what was going to support the cotton farms. And most Mexican legislatures said, whoa, 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 whoa. Slavery, we can't go with that one, I'm sorry. When they had the constitutional debates in Mexico City, there were only a couple things that everybody could agree on. One, it's going to be a Catholic country. Spanish is going to be our official language, and we all think we should outlaw slavery in the national constitution, all right? That was basically the only points of agreement you can find in the constitutional debates. And the reason they didn't want to keep slavery, there's a lot of reasons that most Mexicans voiced about why they didn't want to keep slavery. First, they just fought a war for independence and liberty. Sounded really bad if you then endorsed slavery, right? This is a debate that happened in the United States as we form our new nation, where the founding fathers realized the contradiction between fighting for liberty and freedom for ourselves, but keeping this whole slavery thing legal at the same time. So that was a motivator. Another motivator is that most Mexicans pointed out that chattel slavery, African chattel slavery, the way it was practiced in the United States, was not a part of the economy in most of Mexico by 1821, all right? I want to make it clear. Mexico had imported huge numbers of enslaved Africans in the 1500s and 1600s to work in the mines, but that turned out to not be a very good investment because those people would die and you lost your money, and it was much easier to enslave the local Indian population and put them to work in various forms of debt peonage. So there's unfree labor in Mexico, all right, writ large, but chattel slavery, African chattel slavery, the way it was practiced in the United States, was not a part of most Mexican states at this time. So you can get rid of it really easily without giving up very much, right? So that was another argument. But the third reason is the main reason, right? Mexico is now a new country in 1821, all right? What does it need to survive? international friends. And what is the biggest, most powerful nation of the 19th century? Right, England, Great Britain, right? And what happens to be the biggest holder of Mexican debt at the time that Mexico becomes independent? England. And who happens to be the leading abolitionist, anti-slavery nation in the Atlantic world at this time? England, right? Who is one country you can't afford to upset if you're Mexico. England. So if you don't outlaw slavery, this is going to be a problem for Mexico. And so all Mexicans could agree this is a great thing to outlaw. Nobody's against this, except there's this one weird corner of Mexico, right up there, northeastern side over there, where you hear any different voices saying anything else whatsoever, where you have Stephen F. Austin and the Tejanos who are saying, now hold on a second here. We understand what you're saying. We don't like slavery either. Austin often said, I hate slavery. I've never owned slaves. He actually did own slaves at time to time. But the Anglos and Tejanos are saying, we don't like slavery, but we must keep it legal in the short term if we're going to populate Texas with the Anglos and keep it from falling, essentially, to the Comanches and being taken away from Mexico. And so they make all these arguments up and down the board of like, let's keep slavery legal in the short term. Let's make this a means to solidifying the Mexican empire right here and surviving in the short term. All right? They go around and they make this argument to everybody they possibly can. Stephen F. Austin said this a million different ways, but his argument's very clear. The primary product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton, and we cannot do this without the help, that's a nice euphemism there, of slaves, right? Erasmus Seguin was well aware of this too. They were on the same page. Again, it's Anglos and Tejanos working together in alliance, and they're arguing to every legislator they can who's helping to write the Constitution, saying we've got to keep slavery legal, all right? So they do that as much as they can. Then the debates end. Austin goes back to Texas. The Constitution is published, the National Constitution of Mexico, in 1824, October of 1824. And when it's published, all right, it gets sent up here to Texas. In San Antonio, here's where the mail would come up from Saltillo. And it came once a month here, all right? And they're waiting for the Constitution to show up because they want to see what it says about slavery. And so when the mail finally got here, they ripped it out of the saddlebag of the writer who came up here. They've been waiting to see what it finally says, and they throw it down on the table, and they start reading through it. And they go through the whole Constitution, and they're looking for issue and the clauses on slavery, and they find nothing. All right? They get to the end of the whole thing. Nothing on slavery. We must have missed it. They flip it over. They go back through it. What does it say? It says nothing about slavery. And that's not on accident. All right? The National Constitution of Mexico is a federal document, much like the United States Constitution is a federal document, right? Which is to say there's powers reserved for the national government and powers reserved for the state governments. And so in Mexico, anything that's written to this Constitution of 1824 was something for the national government to deal with. If it wasn't mentioned, whose job is it to deal with? The individual states, right? So if you don't mention slavery in this, what have you done? You've made it an issue for the states to deal with, which is much how the United States deals with the problem of slavery in the 1789 Constitution, right? And so when they make slavery an issue for the states to decide, that's a really clever way to dodge the issue. Because if every state gets to write its own constitution and write its own policy on slavery, what is every single state in Mexico going to do? Outlaw slavery, right? And so what can they tell the British? We've outlawed it everywhere, throughout the whole country. It's just this one weird corner over there where it might be slightly different for a short time, but we can tell the British Empire we've basically done our duty and there's no big deal right there, right? If you're an Anglo or Tejano and you hear this news here in San Antonio, what's your reaction? Woo! We get to write our own constitution. We get to decide the issue for ourselves. Yes! This is great. This is exactly what we wanted, right? So they're really excited for like 5 minutes. And then somebody says, now hold on a second here. Doesn't look like we're going to be our own state within Mexico. Because Texas did not have a big enough population, thank you Comanches one more time, to be its own state within Mexico. So it is attached to its southwestern neighbor, Coahuila, to make the awkwardly named state of Coahuila y Tejas as a new state. And that meant the capital of Texas is not going to be in Texas, it's going to be the capital of Coahuila, which is down here, Saltillo, which you may notice on the map is a long way from Texas, right? And the state legislature that's going to write the new state constitution is going to be dominated by Coahuilans because it's appropriated, or its representation was done by population. Coahuila had a much bigger population. So there are going to be 11 members of the Coahuila legislature that's going to write a new state constitution. Only one person on that is going to be a Texan, right? So who's going to get outvoted every single time? The Texan. So the debates over slavery go down to Saltillo, and they write a state constitution in Saltillo, and the debate over slavery happens one more time, basically. A large contingent of Coahuilans also wanted to outlaw slavery. The Tejanos and the Anglos said, no, that's a terrible idea, we want to keep it legal. This is one of the plazas in Saltillo, a picture taken during the US-Mexico War. And so in Saltillo, they have the same debates over again over the slavery issue. The Tejanos and the Anglos make their arguments, we must keep slavery legal. And so when the debates finally end and the Constitution of the state of Coahuila, Texas is published in March of 1827, they're waiting to see what it says. And they're waiting for the mail to come, and it's once a month arrival from Saltillo, and it comes up the road here to San Antonio. And much like when the national Constitution came, they're all excited and nervous. And they get the Constitution out of the saddlebags and they throw it down on the table and they start going through the state Constitution to see what it says about slavery, right? This time they don't have to go through the whole thing. It's Article 13 of the state Constitution. And when they get to Article 13, what it says is slavery will be outlawed in the state of Coahuila, Texas. Really, really slowly, all right? So the Coahuilans had heard Stephen F. Austin and the Tejanos and their arguments, and they said, all right, you guys are upset, you don't want to get rid of slavery now, we want to get rid of it eventually, so maybe we can find a moderate middle ground in all of this. And so what Article 13 said was, we're going to outlaw things slowly, and here's how we're going to do it. All slaves currently in Texas will remain slaves for the rest of their lives. Nobody's going to be freed by this, all right? And Anglo colonists, we heard you, and you said this is really important for cotton farming, so we're going to give you a 6-month window to bring in more slaves. Go down to New Orleans, load up, bring them in. All of them will be slaves for the rest of their lives. None of them will be freed either. The only people who will be freed are the children of those enslaved in Texas. They will become the first people to become free, and so freedom will basically take a generation to come to slavery in Texas. And the Coahuilans pat themselves on the back and say, this is a good, moderate, reasonable way to deal with this problem. Who, I ask you, could possibly object to such a calm, rational way to deal with this issue, right? This did not sound calm and reasonable and rational to Austin or the Tejanos here in San Antonio, all right? Because when they hear this, they think this is a crisis of the first order and not something that's going to take a generation. It's a crisis right now, all right? How do we know this? Because they said it at the time. Stephen F. Austin calls an emergency meeting in his colony to deal with this problem right now. Why is it such a challenge to them? Simple. Because in 6 more months, if you can't bring any more enslaved people to Texas, nobody's leaving Mississippi to come to Texas. Nobody's leaving Alabama to come to Texas. Nobody's going to give up what makes those plantations so incredibly profitable and come to Mexico if you can't bring that labor system with them. So as far as they were concerned, they had 6 months to deal with this problem, all right? So Stephen F. Austin and his colonists have a meeting. They sit around a table. They say, how can we fix this? And they come up with what you could only describe as a zany scheme to get around this, all right? And their plan is that what they want is a law passed in Saltillo. And the law will say, listen carefully because this is kind of sneaky, but the law will say any contract you sign in the United States will be legal in Mexico. Does that make sense? So if you hire a carpenter to build you a house in New Orleans and you guys get to Mexico and you've signed a contract, that carpenter is still obligated by the contract to build you the house. All right? It has to sound simple if you're going to get it through the Saltillo legislature. All right? What's the purpose of this law? You can keep slavery alive by calling it contract labor. All right? You're going to bring your slaves to the edge of Mexico and then you're going to free them. But once you free them, of course, in exchange for their freedom, you'll have them sign 99-year service contracts. You know, after 99 years, you're free to go, do whatever you feel like doing, have a great retirement, right? But to learn the mysteries of agriculture or the mysteries of domestic service, that's what they use English common law as their basis. They're going to keep slavery alive as contracted labor, right? Think about that for a second. They are so attached and feel so strongly that migration to Texas depends on cotton and this plantation system, that they're going to go to this length to try to keep it alive, to keep the colonies alive, is remarkable, right? So they come up with this idea. Can they get that passed by themselves in Saltillo? No, they're not the representatives in Saltillo. Who do they need? The Tejanos here in San Antonio to represent Texas. And so they send this idea to San Antonio. The Tejanos react. Well, how do you think they react? Woo! It's a great idea. Why had we not thought of this? And so the gentleman over there, Jose Antonio Navarro, he's one of two representatives in Saltillo at the time. He actually is the one who takes the proposal to Saltillo, and he gets it passed. He gets it past the Saltillo legislature, which becomes known as Decree 56, but they get it through the legislature, all right? And Navarro basically can't believe they bought it. How do we know this? Because he wrote a letter to Stephen F. Austin going, I can't believe they bought it. He doesn't actually say that. But in 19th century flowery speak, he says, go ahead with your plan. That's what he tells him. And so he sends to Austin basically the green light. And Austin, when he gets this news, just so happens to be ready with a fill-in-the-blank contract that says, put the names of the slaves here, write 99 years over here, get it signed, notarized, you can come on to Texas with your slaves like nothing ever happened, right? He sends that to the New Orleans newspapers to be published, where it is published under the headline, I am not making this up, How to Avoid the Laws Against Slavery in Mexico. Do the following, all right? And so with a notarization on a contract, you can bring slaves into Texas, and that migration pattern can continue from there. And so that begins in Louisiana. Migration continues under that. You have slavery continuing. And word of this quickly gets back to Mexico City. The consul in New Orleans starts writing all these alarmed letters to Mexico City saying they're getting around our laws and they're thwarting our authority, right? And in Mexico City, this combined with other fears about the Fredonian Rebellion that happens in December 1826, the fact that there's a lot of rebellions across a lot of Mexico, Yucatan, for example, and so there's an effort in Mexico City to centralize authority across the entire country, Texas being one of the places they are concerned about their authority, right? And so as a result of all of this, Mexico decides that the way to deal with this problem going forward is to shut down the border with the United States and to prohibit any more Anglo-American immigration into Mexico, which they pass as a law, the law of April 6th, 1830, trying to seal the border with the United States and end this threat now to Mexico, all right? And that might have worked. We'll never know. It didn't work. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, one of which is inability to enforce it. But a bigger reason, I would argue, is that at that exact same moment, cotton booms again. Right? You guys remember the boom from 1815 to 1820 when prices skyrocket? All right. Well, they stay pretty good through the 1820s. In 1830, they skyrocket again, and they hit 30 and 40-year highs. All right. Liverpool will pay top everything for cotton. And so the incentives to grow cotton are bigger than they've ever been before now. At the same moment, Mexico is trying to seal the border. You know what the result is? Massive immigration from the United States. I'll give you guys two numbers. Listen to this. In 1830, there's about 10,000 settlers in Texas. That's when they try to seal the border. 1830, 10,000. 1835, 5 years later, there's 21,000. It more than doubles in 5 years. At the exact same moment that Mexico is trying to seal the border, you have a much bigger immigration flow from the United States than ever before, being driven by the cotton economy. And all of these things are what ultimately culminate in the Texas Revolution. If you want to know the road to the Texas Revolution, all right, you want to understand that fight, all right? It's Mexico trying to control this migration pattern at the same time. These incentives have never been bigger, all right? Those things clash in all kinds of ways that result in the revolution itself in 35 and 36. In the aftermath of all of that, something amazing emerges in North America, all right? An independent republic dominated by Anglo-Americans, dedicated to growing cotton. We've seen two of these. The one you're more familiar with is the Confederacy, all right? But the Republic of Texas was all of that. It was a dry run for the Confederacy. It was everything the Confederacy wanted to be. It was a nation dedicated to growing cotton and therefore dedicated to slave labor as the means to making that profitable. That's why the Republic of Texas needs to be studied more, needs to be understood more. It's not been examined by scholars the way it needs to be and understood and appreciated for the the incredible microscope it is, because it's the only time in North America that's actually succeeded. The Confederates don't win their war. But the Republic of Texas had 9 whole years to try out this idea. And it's our only window into what that would have meant and what it would have meant for the Confederacy in the 1860s had they succeeded, right? And it's built on cotton because 95% of all exports from Texas at this time was cotton. 95%. That makes Detroit's economy look incredibly diverse by comparison, right? It's all they've got. And so therefore, they are dedicated as a slaveholders' republic. How do we know this? Because they said it. And they said it in their Constitution. All right? For those of us who grew up in Texas, we've all memorized this in 4th and 7th grade. Right? The Republic of Texas Constitution. If you don't remember it perfectly, I'll save you. I'll give you the quick Cliff Notes version. It's a quick copy of the U.S. Constitution. Right? Crossing out United States, put in Texas, skip some flowery language. There are some differences, but the most important one is the issue of slavery. Section 9 of the Republic of Texas Constitution goes beyond anything any constitution in North America ever does with slavery, including the Confederacies. All right? It defends slavery in no uncertain terms. The Republic can never outlaw slavery. The Republic's Congress and president can never touch slavery. Slaveholders themselves cannot free their own slaves unless they throw them out of the Republic of Texas. Why are they building iron walls around this? Because it's going to be a cotton empire. It's going to be their future, they hope. All right, so they're trying to build up support for their economy, but they're also only going to survive as a republic if they have migration from the United States, right, from the South. And so who do they have to convince that this is a safe place to move your plantation? People from Mississippi, people from Alabama, people from Louisiana. This is an advertisement that this is going to be a paradise and a sanctuary. From who? From abolitionists, from anti-slavery agitators, which if you know your U.S. history in the 1830s, Garrisonian abolitionism is rising up, all right? It's becoming more powerful than it's ever been. It's the first time, really, in the 1830s that you have this as a political force, and people in Mississippi are becoming nervous. People in Alabama are becoming nervous. And so you have anti-slavery politicians like John Quincy Adams here. You've got abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison over here who are screaming and yelling about slavery. Texas is saying, we're a sanctuary for cotton farmers. You can come here and you can be safe. And so they think this is going to be the key. Declaring themselves a slaveholders' republic will be the key to the prosperity of Texas and as an independent republic. All right? The result, though, is that Texas, and this is why this is an insight in what would have been for the Confederacy had they actually won and not lost their war. The Republic of Texas becomes isolated internationally because nobody will recognize them as an independent republic. And that comes back time and time again to the slavery issue. The United States rejects Texas for annexation. That's a whole other story. They thought they'd be a republic for about 30 seconds. But the United States rejects annexation over the issue of slavery. Here's an anti-Texas meeting in Boston where they call Texas, quote, that valley of rascals, which I think should be a bumper sticker in the state. I think that'd be really good. All right? And Texas shrugs off rejection by the United States, but we talk about art, all right? We're here for the art exhibit, right? We're here for this period. This is not Texas art. This is anti-Texas art that is being produced at this time period. And this is the image that Texas has at this time period. This is an anti-Texas cartoon that shows the public relations problem that Texas has during this time period. Here's Texas, young Texas, perched on the back of an enslaved person, right, who's been tied up and whipped badly with a cat of nine tails. Texas themselves, you can see, has leg cuffs and daggers as escaped from jail, and is a mongrelized, terrifying mix of Anglos, Mexicans, Indians. You can see all kinds of influences right here. This is the image Texas had internationally. And the British refused to recognize Texas because of the slavery issue. Most of Europe refused to recognize Texas for most of this period for similar reasons and not to upset the British as well. And so Texas remains isolated internationally. They can't get loans, they can't get trade agreements, they can't do anything. But wait, say most Texans, what we do have is cotton. That'll save us, right? Problem is, the Panic of 1837 and cotton prices collapse. The good times don't go on forever, and it's like when oil prices tank in Texas, we feel the effects. When cotton prices tanked in 1837, Texas felt the effects massively because they were a one-crop economy. 95% of their exports are cotton. Now they can't sell the only thing that they have to sell. And so when the cotton prices went to the floor, Texas went into an economic tailspin and are basically collapsing. And so they try printing their own money as a way of trying to save themselves, it does no good. It'd be like you printing money in your basement. Right? It's backed by the faith of absolutely nothing. Although, again, are great examples of art. And they love cotton so much that they actually put cotton on their money. They try taxing their citizens as a way of raising money. All governments do this, including the Republic of Texas. And actually, the Republic of Texas taxed enormously as a way of trying to save itself. I know you guys can't read it, but this is a tax sheet from the Republic. And all those little squiggles at the top right there, those are categories of property that if you owned them, you were going to pay taxes on them. All right? They charge people for pretty much everything they possibly could. This is a tax receipt from a guy named William Anderson. And you guys can't read it, but most of those are entries for land that he owned. So he had to pay taxes on that. He had to pay taxes on a slave he owned, 75 cents for a 10-year-old. And he had to pay taxes because he owned a metal clock. They taxed metal clocks in the Republic of Texas. Also 75 cents, I want to point out, all right, for a total tax bill of almost $25. Problem is, nobody had any money. So you can tax them all you want. You're not going to get anything from all of that. And so the Republic of Texas kind of goes into this, not kind of, goes into a massive tailspin. And so we often talk about the Republic during this period as going from Sam Houston as president to Mirabeau Lamar, back to Sam Houston and some guy named Anson Jones at the end. And that's a fine way to teach it. But the reality is both of these guys are handcuffed by this basic reality that nobody will recognize Texas, nobody will buy their cotton, and they are spinning into the ground financially in a way that they can't deal with. All right? That's why I love this image of the Republic of Texas Capitol. It didn't look like this at the time, but it's a fitting metaphor for the situation that Texas found itself in by the mid-1850s, right? And how do we know they felt this way? Because they said it. All right, this is Washington Miller, Sam Houston's personal secretary, describing Texas when Sam Houston regains the presidency. He says, "We're in a most uncertain and precarious condition, without strength and worse than all, without confidence in ourselves. We are in collapse, perfectly prostrate and powerless." So why does Texas join the United States? Because they had to. There was no choice. It was either that or be reconquered by Mexico, who had invaded twice in 1842, or the Comanches, or both. And so an annexation is a long and detailed story that we can get into some other time. But when Texas does join the United States in 1845, it begins that war with Mexico we started with, right? And brings in the modern American Southwest. And so when you think about the modern border of the United States and what we're debating today, this is the origin of that. The place we're standing in right now is the origin of all of that. You have to understand this half century to understand where we are and to understand what North America looks like and to understand all that art and how it represents the ideas of Texas and the history of Texas in many ways. Because so much of what you will see is a part of these stories. And so much of what isn't in there is over here. And you have to understand the contrast between the two to really understand what's being talked about and what isn't and why that matters. So anyway, thank you guys for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
So, are we saying that we have about 4 minutes? About 4 minutes for questions? So, if you have questions. And after the questions, there'll be a reception outside in about 10 minutes in the Great Hall. So, questions. You can take the mic if you like.
Is this live? Okay, good.
So the British wouldn't recognize Texas, but they were the source of the problem because they were importing the cotton.
Sure.
So how did their business people and their abolitionists work this out?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very long, complex story. I wrote a whole book, actually, that and I'm just saying, it's my mom's favorite book, so if you want an endorsement. It talks a lot about that. It's a great question. The short answer to your question is, so Texans in the Republic thought that the British would want their cotton so badly that they would overlook the slavery thing. And the British told the Texans, no, we're already getting lots of slave-produced cotton from Mississippi already. We don't need your slave-produced cotton, because if we do that, we're recognizing and approving a whole country based on slavery. And that's actually worse for us. And so the British avoided that originally. But for those of you who know the Republic period, the British do ultimately recognize Texas, right? And the reason they do so, again, this is complexity I didn't have time to get into in the talk, but I'm glad you brought it up, because the reason they do so is that the British realize that Texas, by the early 1840s, is so weak that they come up with a scheme that they hope that if they recognize Texas, that they'll be able to force Texas to get rid of slavery. Because what the British really want is a source of free labor cotton. That'll be good for them in all kinds of ways, mostly politically within the British Empire. And so that's one of the reasons that they ultimately do recognize Texas in the early 1840s as a way of getting influence and hopefully forcing a weak Texas to do what the British Empire wants them to do.
Does free labor cotton even exist?
At this time, not really, no. It doesn't. No, it's not a figment. They think free labor is more efficient. White Northerners also think free labor is more efficient. That's an argument that's going on in the 19th century about what's more efficient, slave labor or free labor. We've still been debating this for a long time. I think the current consensus within the field is that slave labor is actually very efficient and very profitable, morally reprehensible, but is not as inefficient as white Northerners would argue at the time. But the British Empire is also, in 1833, they emancipate a huge number of slaves in the Caribbean, and so they move much more towards free labor as a system that they're embracing as well. Yes, sir.
What was the cause of the cotton price drop?
Can everybody hear me on this microphone? Okay, I just want to make sure. So the question is, what was the reason that cotton prices dropped? You're talking about 1837? You have the panics of 1837. And so you have basically the financial system collapses all around. And so what happens is that, so in the 19th century, we call them recessions and depressions now. Then we call them panics because what everybody did was as soon as financial problems happened, everybody panicked, ran to the bank would collapse, and then the whole fiscal system would collapse, and there was no movement of any kind of cash whatsoever. And so everything kind of fell into itself. And therefore, commodity prices would go down precipitously because nobody's buying anything, and demand collapses very quickly. And so the panic in 1837 is similar to the panic of 1819, where you have this broad kind of collapse of everything, and it brought down prices not just of cotton, but across the board of almost all goods. Wheat, for example, tobacco also, they crater during the same period. In the back, sir.
How do you explain the reason that the Congress of Texas signed a contract or a treaty with England to outlaw slavery to the refugees from Mexico?
So the question is, I think if I'm getting your question correctly, why did the Texans sign a treaty with the British to outlaw the international slave trade during the Republic period? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. That was one of 3 treaties that the British proposed to the Texans as a condition of recognition. And so the Republic of Texas had already outlawed the international slave trade when they wrote their constitution. So they're not giving up anything as a result of that. They call that, if you read, and I know you have, sir, but if you read the debates during that period, one of the things they talk about in there is that the opinions of the world are against the international slave trade as a form basically of enslavement and piracy as they described it. So for the Texas representatives in England, they say, well, we're not giving up anything on that front. For the British, it was a foothold in. It was something that the British did with almost they did it with Mexico, for example. It was something they forced every country that they got into an alliance with to sign as a way of shutting down the international slave trade, which the British saw as a first step to ending slavery writ large in the Atlantic world. First stop the expansion of the African slave trade itself. But it's funny, the Republic of Texas tried to only pass that and not pass the other treaties at the same time. And so they passed the International Slave Trade Treaty and sent it back to London, hoping that they would get recognition once that was done and ignoring the other 2. But when they got back to England, the British say, no, you need to pass the other 2 as well. And so we're not going to do it. So they try to do the minimum they possibly could on this. And we read the diplomatic correspondence of the Republic of Texas, you can see these debates going back and forth among the representatives in London of how can we walk this line as finely as we possibly can. And so for them, that was giving a little to get a lot. Yes? Why did the United States what? Annex Texas in 1845? That's a good question. So the short answer is Texas was rejected in 1837 by Andrew Jackson to be annexed, right, over the slavery issue because it was too contentious between North and South. They're trying again in the 1840s, and this is the real conundrum for Texas. How do we get annexed? Because we need, as a treaty, we need 2/3 of the Senate to approve of that, which means you need white Northerners to agree to bring in a slave state, and that was not going to happen, all right? And so what the Texan representatives did in Washington with the John Tyler administration is that they decided the best way to get all Americans to try to endorse Texas joining the United States is to explain to them that if we don't, the British are going to get into Texas, And if there's one thing that all Americans could agree on at this time is that they hate the British, right? So it's one of those things where they're trying to focus on the common enemy kind of deal, all right, as a way of trying to avoid northern apprehension on bringing in Texas. But that didn't work, all right? And so ultimately what you have is the joint resolution solution, where they finally come up with something that's never been tried before. We're not going to pass a treaty that needs 2/3 of the Senate to bring in Texas, because that's not going to work. We're going to have a joint resolution of Congress that says the House and the Senate both resolve that Texas should join the United States. Is that a legal way to bring in new territory? Who knows? We've never tried it before. We didn't try the Louisiana Purchase before we did that, so it's not necessarily illegal, but they do that. And that comes down to the thinnest margin of votes. In the U.S. Senate, it comes down to 27 votes in favor, 25 against. It's a 2-vote margin that approves this, that gets Texas the offer to be annexed to the United States. It's that close even after all of this by 1844 when that happens.
I think that's about the last question.
Okay.
I wanted to thank all of you for coming. We may have a few moments if you wanted to come up and ask questions, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.